Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. So glad you're here, because today we are tackling something that is absolutely fascinating medically, but literally the stuff of nightmares if you've ever actually had one. Yep, we're talking about urolithiasis, better known as kidney stones. To really wrap our heads around this, I want you to think of your urinary tract like a high-tech organic plumbing system. Your kidneys are the master filters, the ureters are the delicate pipes carrying fluid away, and your bladder is the holding tank. What we're going to explore today is exactly what happens when a literal mineral rock forms and completely jams up those pipes. It is a perfect storm of chemistry and mechanics, and we're going to break the whole shebang down. Okay, let's dive into this step by step using our clinical framework. We'll cover 1, what kidney stones actually are, 2, the causes and risk factors, 3, symptoms and those scary severe complications, 4, how we investigate the urinary tract, and finally 5, management and prevention strategies. All right, kicking things off with Section 1. What are kidney stones? Let's define urolithiasis.
So, urolithiasis is just the fancy clinical term for crystal aggregates, basically little rocks forming anywhere in your urinary tract. We're talking anywhere from way up high in the renal pelvis of the kidney all the way down to the urethra. And if you think this is some super rare thing, well, think again. It is incredibly common. The data shows a lifetime incidence of up to 15%. That's literally more than 1 in 10 of us. And the craziest part? The peak age of onset hits right in the prime of life, usually between 20 and 40 years old.
Now, what's really wild is that these stones aren't all made of the same stuff. There's actually a huge variety in their chemical makeup. Calcium oxalate is by far the main culprit here, making up a whopping 75% of all cases. These guys usually look super spiky and are heavily driven by your metabolism and diet. Then you've got struvite stones, sitting at about 15%. These are unique because they're triggered by urinary tract infections and can grow into these massive, crazy-looking staghorn shapes. Next up, urate stones at 5 to 10%. These are smooth, you can't easily see them on standard X-rays, and they're linked to high uric acid. You'll often see them in patients who also have gout. And finally, rounding it out, we have the super rare cystine stones at just 1%, which are caused by a very specific genetic defect in the renal tubules. So how does this actually play out mechanically? Well, it all starts super small, microscopic really, with crystals clumping together in the collecting ducts of the kidneys. But the real nightmare starts when these stones decide to go on a road trip. You see, our internal pipes aren't perfectly straight, wide-open cylinders. They have natural anatomical bottlenecks. A traveling stone is typically going to get wedged in one of 3 really tight spots. First, the pelviureteric junction. That's right where the kidney meets the ureter. If it somehow squeezes past that, it might get stuck at the pelvic brim, right where the ureter crosses over the iliac vessels. And if it makes it past that, the final boss is the vesiureteric junction, which is the tiny, tiny opening where the ureter finally enters the bladder. When a stone hits any of these bottlenecks, boom, the plumbing backs up entirely. Moving right along to Section 2, causes and risk factors, basically the etiology, or the why behind these stones. You can basically group the causes into 2 buckets, the environmental stuff we expose our bodies to, and the anatomical stuff, how we're actually physically built. On the environmental and dietary side, dehydration is the absolute biggest driver here. Actually, occupational medicine looks at this a lot. Take the U.S. Air Force waiver guides, for example. They heavily highlight how pilots sitting in hot climates doing sedentary work are just incredibly prone to stones. Toss in a diet high in oxalate, we're talking chocolate, tea, rhubarb, spinach, and you're basically baking a stone from scratch. But on the flip side, we have anatomical and metabolic causes. Some folks just excrete way too much calcium in their urine, which is a condition called hypercalciuria. And if you happen to have a congenital structural anomaly, like a medullary sponge kidney, your risk of getting stones over your lifetime skyrockets to an unbelievable 70%. That's massive. All right, on to Section 3, symptoms and severe complications. These are your emergency red flags. So the absolute classic hallmark of a kidney stone is renal colic. It brings on these excruciating ureteric spasms. Patients will almost always describe this severe colicky pain that starts in the loin, so the side and back, and radiates straight down into the groin or genitals. And here's a super cool clinical pearl for you. If a patient has peritonitis, which is inflammation of the abdominal lining, they will lie perfectly, completely still because any movement at all is pure agony. But a patient with renal colic? Exact opposite. The pain is so intense, so spasmodic, they literally cannot stay still. They'll be pacing, writhing, twisting around, just desperately trying to find a comfortable position that, honestly, doesn't even exist. But as insanely painful as renal colic is, The pain itself isn't the only thing we're worried about. We really have to ask the critical question, at what point does this stone cross the line from just being incredibly painful to becoming a true drop-everything medical emergency?
Well, it all comes down to these red flag complications. A stone becomes a life-threatening emergency the second you combine a blockage with an infection. Think about it. If you have infected urine trapped upstream from a blocked stone, you get urosepsis, and that can be rapidly fatal. Plus, that total plumbing blockage creates massive back pressure. Your kidney physically swells up like a water balloon, a condition we call hydronephrosis. If you don't relieve that pressure fast, it will literally crush the kidney's delicate filtering units, throwing the patient into acute kidney injury. And worst case scenario, if a patient only has one functioning kidney and a stone completely blocks it, they develop anuria, zero urine output. That is an absolute, immediate, call the surgeon right now emergency.
Which brings us to Section 4, investigating the urinary tract. Time to do some diagnostic detective work. When we're trying to find the culprit, we follow a very logical, structured timeline. First, we start right at the bedside. A simple, basic urine dipstick is actually incredibly revealing. Why? Because in about 90% of cases, it'll pop positive from microscopic blood. Remember those spiky calcium oxalate stones? Yeah, they're literally tearing up the lining of the ureter on their way down. Ouch. Next, we run lab tests, checking urea and electrolytes to make sure kidney function hasn't tanked, plus we check calcium and urate levels to figure out the metabolic root cause. And finally, we pull out the diagnostic imaging to actually get eyes on the stone itself.
And our absolute gold standard for this? The spiral non-contrast CT, usually called a CT KUB, which stands for kidneys, ureters, and bladder. Now, back in the day, we had to use intravenous contrast dyes, but the CT KUB completely changed the game. Because it doesn't use contrast, it is perfectly 100% safe for a patient whose kidneys might already be super stressed out by the blockage. On top of that, an incredible 99% of all stones show up perfectly on this scan. It tells us the exact size of the stone, the exact anatomical bottleneck it's lodged in, and exactly how much back pressure it's causing. It's a total game changer.
And finally, Section 5, management and prevention strategies. How do we actually treat urolithiasis? So management really exists on a spectrum. For the smaller stones without those scary complications, we go the conservative route. We hit them with powerful pain control, usually NSAIDs, and vigorous, serious hydration. We're talking pushing for more than 2 liters of urine output a day just to naturally flush out the pipes. Now, if we know the stone's specific chemistry, we can get clever with medical therapies, like we can give alkalinizing agents like potassium citrate to literally dissolve urate stones while they're still inside the body. Or we can use thiazide diuretics to stop the kidneys from dumping so much calcium into the urine in the first place. But if we hit those red flags we just talked about, like an infected, totally obstructed kidney, we skip all that and go straight to urgent surgical intervention. Urologists have to move fast to decompress the system. They'll either push a ureter extent past the stone from below, or they'll go straight through the patient's back to place a percutaneous nephrostomy tube directly into the kidney just to drain that dangerous infected urine from above.
All right, which brings us to our final thought for today. The pathophysiology here is complex. The pain is absolutely legendary, and those surgical interventions, pretty intense. But the ultimate defense against this entire horrible cascade is actually remarkably simple. You really have to look at your own habits. We know for a fact that low urine volume is the primary driver of crystal aggregation. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative question to chew on. Given what you now know about how these tiny rocks form and the absolute havoc they wreak on your body, is your daily water intake genuinely enough to keep your own plumbing clear? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Go grab a huge glass of water, stay hydrated, and I'll catch you on the next one.